Hello, everyone. Hello. Before I introduce our speaker, who is from the University of Manchester, I would ask all of you to join me in a moment of silence for the victims of this tragic bombing that occurred just the other day in Manchester. Thank you very much. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker, Colin Talbot, who is Professor of Government at the University of Manchester. Before I start, again, I might mention that we have circulated a background document to you, which is a paper he wrote for the World Bank. Now, this paper gives a very good overview of the system of government in the United Kingdom. It may surprise some of you to know that the system in the United Kingdom actually differs in quite a few important respects to the system of government here in Canada. Of course, it's a unitary country, and we're a federal country, and so on. And you can find in that background document, quite a bit of useful information that may answer questions that you could have in terms of an understanding of their system of government. A few words about Professor Talbot. He has advised a wide range of governments and public agencies, including the United Kingdom Cabinet Office, notably events under Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He has acted as a consultant and advisor to the Cabinet Office on a number of occasions, to the Foreign Office and to the National Audit Office, and he's appeared before quite a number of parliamentary committees in Westminster, including the Treasury Select Committee and the Public Administration Select Committee. Professor Talbot has taught a wide variety of senior public service development programs at various universities and in a number of countries. I might mention that in Canada, he was consulted by the Treasury Board Secretariat during the development of the Management Accountability Framework. I trust most of you are familiar with the math, and so Professor Talbot was involved in that at when it began. He's also the author of a definitive work, The Theories of Performance. It's a groundbreaking book that sets out to understand how to improve public service performance. And I believe that we will have a number of copies available for purchase here. And so without further ado, I would invite Professor Talbot to begin his presentation.
Thank you very much, Tom. I hope everybody can hear me okay. First of all, two apologies. First, for not being there physically with you. I'm afraid that health problems make it difficult for me to travel at the moment. And secondly, pardon for doing this only in English. I don't speak French very well, for which you can blame the English educational system. I know it's your habit to have your meetings bilingually, so my apologies that my contribution will only be in English. As Tom said, I've had nearly 30 years experience now of working on performance issues across the public sector. And what I wanted to give you as a presentation was a fairly high-level view of how that's evolved in the UK, what some of the big issues have been. I've also done work on this, as Tom mentioned, in a number of other countries, including Japan and Australia, and Canada and the United States. So I've had quite a lot of experience with them. Plus, we've done quite a lot of research work on systems of performance measurement in different countries, particularly with my colleague Christopher Pollitt. We did quite a lot of comparative work on the way in which performance was being measured in different branches of government in a number of countries. So I've got a fair degree of experience Plus I've done the getting your hands dirty end of it in terms of working as a consultant with a variety of organisations, mainly in the UK, developing their own organisational performance measuring and management systems, some of which I can tell you lots about, and some I can't because one of them was one of our intelligence agencies, but I will tell you a little bit about that later on. Tom mentioned something about the structure of the British Public Service, and it's very important to understand. Firstly, we're not really a unitary country anymore. We're not a federal country either. Since the early 2000s, we've had significant devolution to the governments of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And although we're not exactly a federal system, it's meant that we've had some interesting changes taking place at the Welsh and Scottish levels in particular. I'm not going to talk a lot about those today, but I can answer some questions if there are any later. But there have been some deviations, differences and experimentation going on in Wales and Scotland, rather different to what's happened in Westminster. Secondly, it's important to understand that Britain has a very one-sided, a lopsided structure to the public sector and the civil service. The civil service accounts for about 10% of public employment in the UK. About 90% of public servants work either for local government, various local services like fire and police, the National Health Service, which is not directly controlled by the central government, and only about 10% work as civil servants in central government, although some of those do work in areas which involve direct service delivery. And the really big areas for central government are the obviously tax collection through HM Revenue and Customs, paying out of benefits primarily through the what we call Job Centres Plus, which pays out most working age benefits, and the other main service, which is controlled from Westminster, is the prison service, which covers England and Wales. Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own prison services, and don't ask me why Wales isn't separate, that's a long story. So that's just to give you some idea of the background to all of this. What I'm going to try and do in the presentation is cover a range of issues which I thought might be useful to give you some overall understanding of the way in which the performance issues in UK public services have evolved over the last nearly 40 years now. And some of the main issues that have come up and some of the things we've learned, and as the title of my presentation suggests, some of the things that we've managed to unlearn and forget about, and in some cases relearn again. So I'll try and tease out some of those. I'm going to try and keep the presentation down to about 45 minutes or so to leave plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. And I'm obviously aware that there's a great deal of interest in many things going on in the UK at the moment, so if there are any more general questions once we've dealt with the ones related to the specific performance issues, I'd be happy to deal with them. So if I can start with, first of all, the history of the way in which performance has emerged in the UK. On this slide, at the top of the slide, you'll see from the early 1980s there were a lot of bottom-up experiments, particularly in health and local government, at trying to measure the way in which services operated. Health and local government in particular were heavily influenced in the early 1980s by Peters and Waterman's book In Search of Excellence. And there was quite a big movement towards trying to develop a better orientation towards servicing customers, users of public services, and measuring whether or not they were satisfied with the services. And I was actually working in local government in the 1980s, and lots of us were pouring through Peters and Waterman and trying to work out how we could apply some of its lessons in local government, and in particular how we could measure whether or not people were satisfied with what we were doing as local government services. So there was quite a big set of experiments going on, but they were largely uncoordinated and undirected by central government. They largely took place within individual organisations in the health service and in local government, and in one or two other services like probation and police, where people started to experiment with some of these things. So that experimentation started to spill over into central government and the civil service really from the late 1980s onwards. The central government began splitting up our civil service into what were called executive agencies or next steps agencies after the report that kicked off setting them up. Between 1988 and the middle of the 1990s, we set up about 140 executive agencies, which at that point employed about 80% of the civil service. And each individual executive agency had to have a set of key performance indicators which were published for that agency. On average, that worked out at about 8 to 10 per agency. They varied over time, and maybe we can talk about that a bit later if you want to know, but there was quite a lot of change in those key performance indicators over the years, and there were some interesting patterns in the way in which they tended to evolve, which repeated themselves later on with some of the other setting up of performance measurement. The key thing that changed was that in the first instance, people tended to try and count either inputs to public services or processes, and did very little about outputs and virtually nothing about outcomes of the services that they were providing. And outcomes actually never really figured until late in the 1990s. So this was the first time that this spread into central government, but by that time, by the late 1980s, early 1990s, virtually the whole of the UK public sector had some sort of performance measurement and public reporting of performance statistics about what they were doing. Everybody from universities to police forces to the military to intelligence agencies in some cases, although that was very limited. So there was a huge spread of performance reporting taking place and lots of learning going on. Unfortunately, most of it tended to be confined to the individual sectors. So health people learnt about how to measure health performance, and local government people learnt about how to manage local government performance measures. But there wasn't that much sharing across the sectors. That did start to creep in the late 1990s, but there wasn't as much of it as there probably should have been. The other big change that took place in the early 1990s was that local government had been experimenting a lot, as I've said, with performance indicators, but it had been done as a bottom-up process from individual local authorities. From 1992 onwards, the Audit Commission, which was the audit body for local government and local health service providers, started imposing a set of standardised key performance indicators on all the 300 or so local authorities in England. I would stress this didn't apply to Scotland and Wales at the time, because the Audit Commission was only responsible for England. And from 1992 onwards, right through until 2010, 2011, the Audit Commission imposed on local government a set of performance measures, usually somewhere around 200 across the whole of local government, that they all had to report on if they had those services every year. And there was a great deal of change in that system as well over the period that it was in existence for over a decade and a half. The final brick in the wall, if you like, was government measuring the performance of its own ministries. Although they'd measured the performance and reported on the performance of civil service agencies since 1988, they didn't really start looking at the way in which ministries themselves were performing until in the middle of the 1990s, when the Conservative government started to introduce something called output and performance analysis. This was attached to the introduction of resource accounting into government departments. And OPAs were just about starting to bed in when the Conservative government lost power in 1997. When the new Labour government came in with a landslide majority in 1997, it decided it wanted its own brand of performance monitoring of central government departments. And it introduced what were called public service agreements, the first lot of which were published in 1998 and early 1999. And they were attached to a new system for public spending called comprehensive spending reviews, which were supposed to take place every 3 years. So the aim was to have a set of performance measures for central government departments, which would be published at the beginning of the 3-year period and reported on throughout the 3-year period before the next spending review. And as you can see from the dates, they were repeated in 2000, 2002, 2004 and 2007 under the new Labour government. Those quick with maths will have spotted immediately that that's not a 3-year periodisation, because although Labour said they were going to do 3-year spending reviews, in practice for the first 6-7 years of the system they did reviews every 2 years. And then in 2004 they extended it to 2007, so it was a 3-year period. And after that they were going to do another spending review had they won the general election in May 2010, but they lost to the Conservatives, and the Conservatives abolished the public service agreements part of the spending review system, although interestingly retained the 3-year spending reviews, although again they tended to change them around a bit, and sometimes over 2 years and sometimes over 3 years. So we now have also the last piece in the jigsaw puzzle, if you like, which was that now every part of UK public services has had some sort of performance measurement and reporting over the last nearly 40 years. In the case of central government, now for over a decade and a half, nearly 2 decades. Sorry, it is over 2 decades. And I've printed at the bottom of this slide, you'll see is a quote from the Conservative Party manifesto, which came out about 10 days ago, in which they commit themselves to continuing to publish operational performance data for all public-facing services. Now, it's a slight reduction because it means for non-public facing services they won't necessarily publish performance data, but that they will publish that data in order to hold people to account. It's important, I think, to realise, though, that this movement, although it sounds quite overwhelming and massive in its size and scope and the depth of reporting that's gone on, and I usually say I think we will probably have been the most performance reported public service in the world. The amount of political interest from government in using that information effectively, both for policy purposes and for managerial purposes, has tended to wax and wane quite a lot, and there's been greater and less enthusiasm for it, and there's been quite a lot of learning and unlearning during that process. If I just give you a couple of small examples. Firstly, in terms of what gets measured, as I said before, what tended to happen was that in the early stages of performance measurement across a whole service or a whole area of public services, people tended to pick the inputs and processes which were the easiest to count and the easiest to put some numbers on. I did a small experiment at one point, and I think that the number of rings taken to answer the telephone for public telephone access to different agencies was probably the most popular performance indicator across the public service. Of course, it doesn't actually tell you very much about the quality of the service being provided, but it was an easy thing to count because you could automate it. As time went on, however, there was some quite significant change. First of all, there was a big change towards measuring outputs, the actual services being delivered, both in civil service agencies and in local government and in the health service and in many of the other local services. We saw a distinct shift over the 1990s towards more output measurement. Although interesting, very few of them, even at that point, were measuring outcomes, and central government made no attempt whatsoever to measure outcomes. And I remember at the time having lots of arguments with people in the civil service about the fact that you, as far as they were concerned, you couldn't possibly measure outcomes of public services, and if you did measure outcomes, you couldn't attribute them properly anyway. All of that changed in 1997 when New Labour came to power, and they very much had a mantra of designing public services around what works and what they called evidence-based policy. And so there was a huge emphasis on trying to ascertain whether or not public services were actually delivering the outcomes that politicians wanted. That began to change with the public service agreements and then cascade its way down through the rest of the system as a consequence of the public service agreements. Public service agreements themselves started off being fairly detailed, not very outcome focused, mainly about inputs and processes and a few outputs. And there were an awful lot of them. There were some 600 to 800, depending on how you counted them, performance indicators and measures being published by the government across central government departments. That changed as the system evolved, and by halfway through the new Labour government period, they'd reduced the number of PSAs to about 120, which was a considerable reduction. And in the very last iteration, in 2007, the number of top-level PSAs actually went down to 30, so they were much more focused on key priorities for the government. And I understand you had some discussion earlier on today about Prime Minister's delivery units, government delivery units. And certainly the delivery unit, which was established in the mid-2000s, had quite a lot of influence over the honing down of performance indicators for central government and performance measurement, and focusing more on a few targets. Although there was also a major political come personal element to this, when the change of government between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown took place in 2007, the incoming Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, actually wanted to abolish the PSA system entirely. He didn't believe in it. I know I've got him on tape saying this because I interviewed him about it a couple of years ago. But Gordon Brown, the incoming Prime Minister, wanted to keep the system, and part of the reason for the reduction to 30 PSAs was a compromise between the two of them, so that they kept them, but they kept them at a fairly high level of abstraction. So let's just to give you a very broad picture, very quick run through of how this system's come into being in the UK, how pervasive it is. I want to move on now to talking about some of the learning and unlearning that's taken place. Probably the most symbolic example of this is this little document, which is called Choosing the Right Fabric. I don't know if you can read it on the slide, but you'll see on the top right-hand corner of the document, it was produced by Her Majesty's Treasury, the Cabinet Office, which are the two main central government bodies, the National Audit Office, which was the supreme UK audit body, the Audit Commission, which was responsible for auditing local government and parts of the health service, and the Office for National Statistics, which was the quasi-independent statistics authority for the UK. I don't know of any other document that was published by those five organisations, who are not renowned for working closely with one another. Even Cabinet Office and Treasury quite often find it hard to coordinate with one another. But they published this document, and the prime aim of it was to, if you like, embed a performance language across the whole of the public sector. And it's full of definitions of exactly what you mean by inputs, processes, outputs, outcomes, quality measurement, customer service, and so on. It's actually a very useful document. What's interesting is it was promptly forgotten. I did a presentation in Whitehall only last year, including some of the people who are now leading on performance issues across UK central government, and nobody in the audience had ever heard of the document, let alone used it. It was unlearned very quickly, which is a shame, because my experience of working with individual agencies has been that where people have learned to speak a common language about performance, and it almost doesn't matter exactly how you define these things, as long as everybody uses the same working definitions, it becomes a lot easier to have conversations inside the organisation about the nature of performance. I said I'd mention one of our intelligence agencies. I did 8 years working with GCHQ, which is our equivalent of the National Security Agency, helping them to develop performance measurement systems internally. I can't tell you about a lot of it because I'd have to kill you if I did, because I'm sworn to the Official Secrets Act. But I can tell you one of the things that happened during that process is we spent a lot of time at the beginning of that 8 years running workshops for people, trying to clarify the language that they wanted to use to describe different ways in which they could measure their performance in gathering and distributing intelligence. And one of the things we found during that, particularly the first year of that process, was that as we gradually went on, people became more and more familiar with the language, and we were running training courses towards the end of the first year where we were having to change the courses as we went along because people already came along knowing what the language was and understanding it and being able to communicate clearly in those terms. Whereas at the beginning of the process we had huge arguments about what the difference between an output and an outcome was, and could you really define them, and so on. So there's been a great deal of learning and unlearning around things like that. I think in individual agencies there's still quite a lot of understanding about the use of common language. In central government, I'm afraid, not quite so much. The second big debate, which characterised particularly the period under New Labour, where targets for various public services became much more prominent, much more public, and much more publicly debated, was critics complaining that the system distorted behaviour, that people would try and game the system. My general retort to that was, well, of course targets and measurement is meant to change behaviour. That's exactly what it's there for. It's meant to prioritise areas of service that we want to see improvement in and try and measure and report on and understand whether or not we're achieving improvements in those areas. But nevertheless, it was the case that in some instances there were cases, particularly in the early stages of introduction of performance measurement and public reporting of performance information, where some public managers were gaming the system, and there were some famous instances of where if you put in, for example, a response time for ambulances to get to the scene of a 999 call, our emergency service, if you made it 8 minutes, then most of them would get there in between 7 and 8 minutes. And there'd be very few afterwards, and there'd be very few earlier than that. And there was clearly a bit of gaming going on in terms of how the timings were being managed and manipulated by local managers. But one of the things I think we can learn from the UK's lengthy experience with this is that that sort of gaming tends to get squeezed out of the system after a few years of using these sorts of systems for performance reporting and management and accountability. And audit organisations play a very important role in that, in auditing the performance data and making sure that it's seen to be clear and above board and it's not being manipulated by the people reporting it. The next thing I wanted to mention, which has come up again and again in the British system, has been what I call the myth of the contract, which is this idea which came from economics. Some of you may be familiar with something called principal agent theory in economics, that government ministers or senior managers were the principals and they would negotiate a performance contract with people lower down in the system who were actually delivering services, and they would hold them to account through performance reporting, and that would work in a sort of quasi-contractual way. That has never really happened. That was the model that was used, for example, in relation to Next Steps executive agencies. The original model as spelt out when they were first set up was that this would be a contract between the minister and the agency chief executive, and that would be what drove the performance of the agency. Well, one of the things I found very early on in my studies of executive agencies was, of course, that there wasn't one principle. Whilst the minister might want to set targets for the agency, it was also the case that, for example, the Treasury and the Cabinet Office were constantly coming out with new ideas about how to drive forward performance in the public sector. So in the early 1990s, as these agencies were being established, central government launched, just as a couple of examples, the Cabinet Office launched something called the Citizens' Charter, which required every agency to have a charter of its own about the standards of service delivery that it would deliver. And that went alongside the key performance indicators which were being set by ministers. And when we analysed a sample of agencies in the mid-1990s and looked at what they were being asked to do from the Cabinet Office and the Charter Unit in the Cabinet Office, and what they were being asked to do by their minister in terms of key performance indicators, there was very little coordination between the two. And that's just one example of this. This also occurred through things like the Treasury wanting quarterly and annual efficiency reports from individual agencies, and the things that they targeted for efficiency measurement and reporting weren't the same as the efficiency measurement and reporting that appeared in things like key performance indicators. So again, there was a disjunction. And we constantly kept coming across this right across public services, where there were in reality not a single contractor at the top, a single principal deciding what the performance of an agency should be, but multiple contractors or multiple people who in practice could set targets or try and steer the performance of individual agencies. The model I came up with, which I used in the series of performance book, which Tom mentioned earlier, this is probably a simplified model of the different branches of government that can and sometimes do, and in a lot of cases try quite hard to influence the way in which executive agencies or public service agencies at the local level or health service bodies deliver their services. So to take an example from this slide, of professional bodies, you wouldn't think of professional bodies as particularly having any influence over government agencies. But we've had a number of disputes where professional bodies, particularly in the medical profession, in the health service, have set standards of performance and behaviour for their members that don't agree with the performance standards and behaviour that is being required by the NHS organisations. In one really dramatic case, for example, the NHS was trying to require midwives to collect ethnic monitoring data and nationality data from their patients. And the midwives professional organisation, which regulates their licence to practice, said if any of them supplied that information, they would be breaching their professional rules and could be struck off the midwives list. So there was a direct confrontation between the professional body on the one hand and the management of the NHS on the other about what sort of performance and what they expected from midwives. In that particular case, the midwives professional organisation won in the end, and the NHS dropped that requirement. So we came up with this model of performance regimes as a way of trying to tease out in any particular agency or setting what it was which was effectively trying to steer the performance of the agencies. And I've been through quite a lot of exercises with individual agencies where we've simply mapped out where the different performance requirements are coming from on the agency. And it doesn't usually involve all of these actors, but it usually involves a significant number of them. And when you look at the performance demands being put on the agencies, they very rarely match up with one another, the ones emanating from different parts of the system. The next point I wanted to make, which follows on very quickly from that really, is that this is partly due to the fact that most public agencies are, sorry, I think I've jumped over slides, yeah. Most public services are embedded in some sort of system. They don't simply produce public services on their own. If you take acute health services, if somebody's going into hospital to have a hip operation, yes, of course, they've got to be treated by the hospital and they have the hip replacement operation, but then there's going to be their GP's practice, which is outside of the hospital system, probably physiotherapy, which may be a community-based physiotherapy system. It may involve changes to their housing arrangements if they're in public housing. It may need assistance from social services, from the local authority. So there's a whole range of organisations which may be involved in determining whether or not somebody who goes into hospital and has a hip replacement operation recovers successfully from that and is healthy and able to walk afterwards, particularly if it's been a long-term condition and they've had problems with obesity or other issues as a result of having a faulty hip.
So all public organisations tend to be embedded in those sorts of complex systems, and very few of them are delivering services on their own. They're part of what in the public sector we would call value chains, and you have to look at the whole of the system to understand what's going on. And if you concentrate only on one part of it, one of the problems is that you can end up with localised deficiencies, for example, leading to inefficiencies in the whole system. The one that I constantly use, mainly because I have personal experience of this because of my own health problems, is if you go into hospital in the UK, when you leave hospital, they tell you what drugs you need to take. Now, before the 1980s, the hospital pharmacy used to give you quite a large supply of the drugs that you needed to take, and if it was only for a short period of time, they would give you the entire supply. When efficiency pressures began to exert themselves on local hospitals in the 1980s, they changed that procedure. So instead of giving you the drugs, they gave you a letter to take to your GP. Your GP would then write you a prescription for the drugs, which you would then take to a private pharmacy to get the drugs that you needed. Now that meant you had a localised efficiency saving in the hospital. Oh, look, good, we don't have to provide these drugs anymore and we're saving money. But if you stood back and looked at it from a systems perspective, which National Audit Office did, you realise that actually that's costing the NHS as a whole 3 times as much as if the hospital simply gave patients the drugs when they left the hospital. And it's one of the complexities of working within these systems of public services, which means you have to be very careful not to put pressure on one particular area of particularly efficiency savings, which may lead to problems in other areas. All of that leads to the conclusion that public services are inevitably complex, and whilst everybody struggles to try and have simple performance reporting and accountability regimes, the fact is you can't do it, and if you try and do it, you try and simplify things. You can do it for a short time, but you usually find that things start to slip back again into more and more complex systems. And one of the things that, again, organisations seem to have learnt and unlearnt quite a lot is you can make a big drive to try and simplify the performance measurement and management systems, make it less onerous on the organisation, but then it tends to, over a period of time, slip back into being more complex and more difficult, and you have to be very careful with that particular process. Part of the reason for that as well is that even in individual agencies, there's a constant pressure to change and adapt what you want to measure. If I go back to our executive agencies in the civil service, one of the things which we found looking at their performance indicators, they usually had about 8 or 10 key performance indicators for each individual agency, was that the key performance indicators were set by the minister. The average lifespan of the minister in the 1990s in the UK was about 18 months, which meant about every 18 months you had a new minister coming in, and one of the first things that she or he did was look around for what can I change, how can I make my mark, how can I do things differently from my predecessor, even when their predecessor was from the same party. And one of the things they started doing was changing key performance indicators. So what one minister had wanted to be seen as being an important key performance indicator was immediately changed by somebody else within a year or two. And we found when we did a study of a selection of agencies over an 8-year period, that at the beginning of the establishment of the agency, the churn rate in key performance indicators was about 80%. In other words, about 8 out of 10 indicators was being dropped every year and replaced with something new. It tended to settle down towards the end of an 8-year period to about 30 to 40% of KPIs being changed, but they were still being substantially changed in terms of being dropped, and that's without the minor changes that took place to the individual performance indicators. And obviously that makes it very difficult for long-term analysis and accountability to try and see what really whether or not agencies are improving over a long period of time. If you're not measuring the same things, it's very difficult to establish whether or not there's long-term progress in the delivery of those sorts of service. And again, one of the things that people have tried to do is establish a balance between having some core targets and measurements which remain relatively stable over long periods of time, and additional targets and measures and reporting which may change as they go along to try and meet some of those requirements for change. One of the ways a lot of organisations have done this in the UK, dealing with all of the preceding problems, is to have some sort of performance framework. Lots of organisations in the late 1990s and early 2000s started adopting various public or private sector performance frameworks, things like the balanced scorecard, things like we had the European framework for quality management, which you had a similar quality measurement tool in Canada, which was extensively used in the public sector, I know. And there are literally dozens of these sorts of models. In my book, I list dozens of both public and private sector models that are generic ones that have appeared over the last 20 years or so. There's some evidence from the research that we've done that that is quite a powerful tool for dealing with the language problem inside the organisation, because it means if you use a performance framework, it helps people to understand that where the language fits, what the relationship between different measures are. It helps to deal with some of the issues of continuity and change, because if you're measuring, for example, within the balanced scorecard, customer service, you might change the measures you use for customer service, but the fact that you're measuring customer service and trying to improve it over time can remain more stable. And one of the main reasons we found when we investigated these in quite a few agencies was that the senior managers told us they used these frameworks to deal with the complexity of the external performance regimes, the external performance requirements being placed on them. But the other thing we found was, first of all, there was very little evidence about which of the models worked best. Everybody thought theirs was great, but there was very little evidence as to which ones actually worked best, and it was almost seemed to be the case that having any sort of framework helped. And secondly, there was very much a tendency to reinvent the wheel and redevelop things. So, for example, when we looked at 8 agencies at both central and local government level who were using or claimed to be using the balanced scorecard, which is, as you know, if you're familiar with the balanced scorecard, has 4 quadrants in it. Of the, I think the agencies that we looked at, only a couple of them were using 4 quadrants, and they weren't the same as the ones used in the actual balanced scorecard. And most of the rest were using 5, 6, 7. In one case, the British Council, which some of you probably come across, was using 8 quadrants for its, quadrants is the wrong word, but they were using 8 segments for defining their performance framework. So there was a lot of reinventing going on, and unfortunately not enough sharing of that across public services, so people didn't understand what progress people were making in different areas. The final point I wanted to make generally is about validation of performance information. One of the lessons we have learnt, I think, in the UK and has tended to stick is that if we're going to use performance information for performance accountability to the public and to service users, it has to be validated by some external authority, usually the audit body. In some cases, it's various quality commissions in our health service. The National Audit Office and the Audit Commission did a lot of work on how you validate performance information for public organisations. And it's really important that organisations have that validation. And if I can give you an example, when the new Labour government came to power in 1997, as you can see, there's photographs there of the covers of, they started producing the government's annual report, which was initially based around the public service agreements that they'd commissioned from 1988 onwards. Except, first of all, they didn't report on all of the targets that they'd set in the public service agreements in the annual report. Secondly, what they did report hadn't been verified by anybody outside of the departments themselves. So it was purely based on what they said they'd done, and there was no external audit of it. And it tended to be very selective. So what got reported in the annual report was the places where the government was doing well, and what didn't get reported was the places where the government was doing rather less well. I was at a conference in, must have been about 2002, 2001, 2002, with a bunch of senior civil servants, and I raised some of these criticisms and others did the same. And the then head of the civil service came up to me at the end of the conference and said, it's okay, we've cured the problem with the government's annual report, we're going to stop publishing it. Which was not the point I was trying to make. The point was they could have published it but done it a lot better. On the bottom of that slide I mentioned that they did something similar for the executive agencies in central government, which lasted a lot longer. It actually lasted for 10 years. They published an annual report on all of the executive agencies, which actually became quite an interesting document and was published for the last time in the early 2000s and then was suddenly dropped without explanation by central government. So there's clearly a need for validation of performance information if it's to be taken seriously. I would say, by the way, in terms of impact of this, what difference has it made to individual people? Some of this performance information has become completely embedded in our society now. We're house hunting at the moment. If we ring up an estate agent, so our people, the equivalent of real estate, realtors, the Americans call them, I don't know what you call them in Canada, but if we phone up an estate agent and ask for details of a house, we get sent a pack of information which will include all the information about the local schools, what their performance measures are, their published performance measures against the educational standards which are set centrally by government, what Ofsted, which is the schools inspectorate's periodic reports, have said and how they've rated those schools. And depending on what sort of schools catchment area you're in and how well they're doing on that performance information can make a difference of tens of thousands of pounds to the value of the property that you're buying. So in some areas you could be paying 30 or 40,000 pounds more for a property if it's in a good schools area than if it's in one where the performance information is poor coming from them. So it can have tremendous impact. So my conclusion, and then we can go to Q&As. Firstly, I can't see this turning back. I think the quote I gave you from the Conservative manifesto, who are the people most likely to win the general election we're having at the moment, says they are going to continue to publish performance information. The sort of performance information they're publishing is rather different from what was done under the Labour government, but it's just as comprehensive. It covers just as much of the public sector. It's got a slightly different emphasis in terms of the sorts of things that it measures, but it's still there. And they've made it clear they're going to continue to implement it. It's obviously going to continue to change and adapt, and they've made that clear in their manifesto that they're going to drop some of the more internal performance measurement that's gone on between government agencies that's important for how they work with one another. The third conclusion I come to is that there are no easily designed solutions. The lesson, I think, from our experience in the UK and everywhere else I've looked is that you have to evolve these things into systems that work better. You can't sit down with a wet towel around your head and design the perfect performance measurement and reporting system for any government agency. It's a question of learning and experimentation and iteration. And finally, that forgetting is the biggest problem that we face. I don't know what the situation is like in Canada, but our government has got worse at forgetting things. Sorry, there's something happening on the screen. I hope you can still hear me. Our government's got worse at forgetting things, particularly since everything's gone electronic on web pages and into emails rather than paper files. So, for example, the government reports that I just showed you, the annual reports, the reason that's such a ropey photograph of them is because I had one of them. I had to get photocopies from the British Library to obtain the other two, because despite the fact central government produced tens of thousands of those annual reports, nobody in central government could supply me with one of them when I was looking at it a couple of years ago. They'd completely disappeared, had just been wiped from memory. And there's lots of examples I could give you of that sort of problem. So my general slogan, which is taken from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, is optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect. We have to keep trying to refine and adapt and make these systems work, but we also have to recognise the many problems around them and realise that it's a long and difficult path. Thank you, Tom. I'll stop there.
So I want to thank Colin very much for that presentation, and before we go any further, I want to open the floor to any questions that you may have for him. Please come to the microphones.
Okay. Oh, hello, Professor. Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask you what your opinion is and what your experience has been in the interviews and the research you have conducted in terms of public servant commitment to providing those services, given the churn that you have seen over the time period.
Do you want me to deal with these one?
I'll repeat.
Tom, do you want me to deal with these one at a time?
You want me to repeat the question?
No, it's okay. I got the question. I said,
Okay.
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to take a couple of questions?
Why don't we go one by one?
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a real problem about, first of all, about political commitment at the top of organisations and at the top of government. In British government, we've had quite a lot of variation from under the Thatcher and major Conservative governments in the 1990s. There was a strong commitment to performance measurement and reporting in some parts of the public sector, but not all of it. And there was very little enthusiasm for trying to get central government itself to report on its own services. And the output and performance analysis stuff that I mentioned was sort of slipped in. There was no real political commitment behind it. And it was only when New Labour came in and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were much more committed to public sector reporting and performance improvements that it really began to take off in a much bigger way in terms of its impact inside the public service, and particularly its political salience, and it's being seen as being important. And we even had cases, in one case, for example, an education minister who resigned because she'd failed to meet one of the education targets that had been set for her ministry in the middle of the 2000s. So there's a problem about commitment at the top. There was the political top. There was also a problem about commitment from particularly the top of the civil service, because in our civil service, senior civil servants at the top 3 levels or so also tend to change almost as frequently as ministers. So the average length of time in post for a civil servant at the top of ministries is usually about 2 years. And people move around considerably, not just within ministries, but between ministries. So, for example, I knew somebody who went from being head of roads policy at the Department of Transport to being head of human resources in the Home Office. A complete switch of jobs, completely different professions. And it's very difficult for people in those circumstances to get up a huge amount of enthusiasm for particular performance commitments that they've made over a 2, 3, 4 year period. Lower down the organisations, people tend to be more stable, tend to stay in the same jobs for longer, and there is more commitment.
I have another questioner.
We've just, last year and a half, have launched a effort to implement deliverology within our government, and there's a renewed commitment to measuring performance and showing results and being open to sharing our information openly. And I'm currently somewhat optimistic about what I'm hearing. I'm wondering whether you could share your lessons learned and any observations you might want to convey to us about the British experience.
Okay, yeah. First of all, I think particularly in the early days, the delivery unit in the UK was very successful. It focused on 4 areas of government policy: health, education, transport and criminal justice, and ignored everything else. It created this delivery unit, which the model for which actually goes back a long way to something similar to the efficiency units and efficiency scrutinies which Margaret Thatcher set up in the early 80s. But it was a very focused unit which supported ministers and the ministries, and it had huge political commitment in that the Prime Minister attended quarterly meetings with all 4 of those ministries individually, and the delivery unit and the civil service from the Cabinet Office and the civil servants from the ministry to review what progress they were making. And that was from a Prime Minister. That was a huge commitment. I would, however, just give a word of caution. Firstly, there's a very good report by our Institute for Government, if you're interested, on the 25 or so examples of setting up delivery units that have now happened around the globe. It's been copied quite extensively, and Michael Barber, I think, must have clocked up more air miles than any other human being on the planet. And one of the things they warn is that in different contexts it doesn't necessarily work as well, and that there can be severe problems, particularly when there's not political commitment to it. And in a sense, we had that ourselves, in that in 2010, when New Labour left office and were replaced by the coalition government of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, one of the first things they did was to abolish the delivery unit. They subsequently admitted it was one of the worst, or at least some of them did, that it was one of the worst decisions they made when they first came to office. And 2 years later, they re-established it. To save face, they changed the name to the implementation unit, but it was very, very similar to the delivery unit which had been set up under the Labour government. So at least that's probably proof that it's something like this is necessary and can work. But I would also urge you to read the Institute for Government report, because it does show some examples of where things can go wrong with delivery units if they're not focused, if they become overstaffed and bloated, if they don't develop good relationships with the ministries that they're supposed to be working with. And I would just throw in one additional comment about that. When Christopher Pollitt and I looked at the relationships between executive agencies and ministries in Britain, the Netherlands, Norway and Sweden, Finland and Sweden a decade or so ago, one of the things that was really important about the performance relationship was that both sides treated each other as adults and had an adult conversation about the way in which performance developed. And this applies, I think, to delivery units. One of the dangers, and certainly what's happened in some delivery units in other countries, is that they become a mechanism for exercising more parental authority over what they say is the way with children running public services or individual ministries. And when you get that sort of unbalanced dialogue going on, then you can very easily run into problems.
Yeah, can you maybe email us the reference that you made to the report that examines the effectiveness of the Prime Minister's delivery units, so we can circulate that?
I will send you a link to the report itself, and there's also a very good summary of the report which was put out by an agency in Australia. So if you don't want to read the entire Institute for Government report, you can read the summary of it the Australians produce, which is very useful. I'll send you both of them when we're finished.
Thanks very much. Are there any other questions from the floor? I have a couple of questions myself. One in particular, there's a famous remark that's attributed to, I think it's attributed to Winston Churchill, about the difference between England and America, that they were divided by a common language. And this arises because there's a continual reference to executive agencies. The word executive means different things here than it does in the UK. So executive in the UK, my understanding, it means simply that the agency is delivering services. In other words, executing. Executive in the sense of executing. In Canada, when you say an executive, you're referring to a top-level person. So when you said an executive agency, it might cause a little bit of misunderstanding. So my question is about the structure of the executive agencies. Now, these started as the Next Steps agencies, but I wondered if you could elaborate a bit about them, because it's very different to what we have here, which are departments of government. And you know, that it makes a great deal of difference in terms of how they deal with identifying performance targets and so forth. You know, for example, there's the jobs agency and so forth. They're organized in terms of particular functions of government, as opposed to, we have large departments that carry out a great many different functions. Usually they cohere. So that's one question I'd have for you.
Okay, well, in terms of the structure of government, the original aim was to create what we call executive agencies, or rather what the government calls executive agencies, which were delivery agencies. They were the ones who would deliver particular services. The problem with, there were several problems with that. One is that delivery means slightly different things. Obviously, the Job Centres Plus in paying out benefits and helping people to find employment is delivering services. An agency which is primarily concerned with policy development, like the National Weights and Measures Laboratory, is not delivering services to anybody, it's developing policy primarily. So there was some confusion there about what the relationship was in terms of who did policy and whether or not these executive agents really were operational delivery agencies. Secondly, there was huge disparity in sizes. So in the early 90s, the top 5 agencies, as they were then, which was Inland Revenue, Customs and Excise, HM Prison Service, the Benefits Agency and the Employment Service, two sets of those have merged since then, so there's only 3 left now, big agencies, employed the bulk of civil servants, or at least a very large proportion of civil servants. Then there was a very long tail of very small executive agencies, in some cases only having 30 or 40 staff. My favourite was the Armed Forces Dog Training Centre, which trained dogs for the various branches of the Armed Forces, which had about 30 or 40 staff and a lot of Alsatians, but was a separate executive agency. And that obviously created power imbalances. So for the big agencies, the agency chief executives really had some power and clout and could influence policy themselves. For the much smaller agencies, the agency chief executive was usually a fairly low-level civil servant whose career would be elsewhere in their department or other parts of the civil service. And it was very difficult for them to be autonomous and exercise any real managerial autonomy. They did what they were told by the ministries, by and large. I have to say, since the height of the executive agencies movement, and I should stress that, again, one of the differences in the UK is this was all done without any legislation. It was all done as administrative decisions by central governments without any legislation at all. Since the height of that movement, where we had 80% of the civil service working in about 140 agencies, I would guess at the moment, I haven't counted recently, but we're down to probably 30 or 40 agencies and much less than 50% of the civil service working in them, because the political steam behind that, the political momentum behind it, disappeared when the new Labour government came in 1997. It was one of the things they thought of as being primarily a Thatcher innovation and didn't really pursue.
I'll just check if there's any other questions on the floor at this point. I do have a couple more. I don't want to belabor. One question is about, yes, is there a question here somewhere? No? Okay. The efficiency reviews that were done by the Treasury, are those still going on, and what would be their impact?
they don't do efficiency reviews in the same way. The original, this changed considerably over the years. The original efficiency unit was set up by Margaret Thatcher in 1979. It was one of her first acts over the first weekend she was Prime Minister. She brought in the guy who had been Chief Executive of Marks and Spencer's, a big clothing and food company in the UK, to set up the efficiency unit, and they carried out a series of what were called efficiency scrutinies, which were 90-day scrutinies run by a group of young civil servants drawn from across the civil service, who would go into an agency or part of a ministry, look at what was going on, identify efficiency savings, report back on them, and then the ministers would instruct the ministry to go ahead and implement these things. That had very mixed impact. At the time, the National Audit Office, about 6 years into that process, did an assessment of how well they were doing, and they said that only about half of the efficiency savings that had been identified had actually been implemented. The next big wave of efficiency saving took place under the Labour government in the middle of the 2000s, where they introduced the Gershon Efficiency Savings Scheme, which was attached to the public spending rounds, required government departments to come up with big efficiency savings. Again, that initially had huge political force behind it, but again, it tended to wane over time. The current government still includes in its annual decisions on budgetary allocations to departments assumptions about efficiency to be made, but there's no real structure behind that anymore in terms of a central efficiency unit or anybody who's actually helping the departments to identify efficiency savings and implement them.
Well, thank you very much. I want to again thank you, Professor Talbot. Very interesting talk, and I think it's given us a perspective on current developments here in Canada, including the answer you gave to the question about deliverology. And we've certainly very much enjoyed having you, even if we've had to rely on technology rather than having you here present. But it's been delightful, so thank you again.
Thank you very much, Tom.